Good morning and welcome to the J of Metro Detroit's 71st Annual Detroit Jewish Book Fair. My name is Nancy Finkel, a member of the Book Fair Steering Committee. It is my pleasure to welcome you to Rebel Daughter with Lori Banov Kaufmann. We are celebrating over 70 years of the Detroit Jewish Book Fair and a return to a more traditional book fair events in person at the J. To see our full event schedule, watch events you may have missed, and browse our online store, please visit our website at jccdet.org/bookfair. If you enjoy this event and other book fair events, please consider becoming a patron or donating to Book Fair. You can do that at our website as well, jccdet.org/bookfair. We rely on community support to make this annual event possible, so thank you in advance for becoming part of our family. The Book Fair team would like to thank our day sponsor, Andy and Larry Wolf, co-sponsors Sis Maisel and Merton Siegel. I would like to extend our deepest gratitude to the whole Book Fair committee. Your dedication, innovation, commitment, and hard work make all of this possible. We have a fascinating event for you today, and we want you to be a part of it. You can ask questions and offer comments in the YouTube comments section below, or by texting the number in the corner of your screen. Our speakers have a great discussion prepared, and they will take as many of your questions as they can. While you're here at our YouTube channel, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the reminder bell. That way you'll never miss any of our exciting virtual events. The focus of today's event is Rebel Daughter with author Lori Banov Kaufmann. We also have with us Rebecca Starr, Director of Regional Programs for the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. As soon as she learned of the first century tombstone that inspired Rebel Daughter, Lori Banov Kaufmann wanted to know more. She resolved to bring this ancient love story to life. Before becoming a full-time writer, Lori was a strategy consultant for high-tech companies. She has a BA from Princeton University and an MBA from Harvard Business School. She lives in Israel with her family. Rebel Daughter is the winner of the 2021 National Jewish Book Award. Rebecca Starr is the Director of Regional Programs for the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America, where she also oversees all program development, management, and partnerships in the Midwest region. A proud product of the University of Michigan, she is a respected educator and community organizer. Please join me in welcoming Lori Banov Kaufmann and Rebecca Starr.
Thank you. Thank you, Nancy, so much. Good morning to you and happy Election Day to everybody in the U.S. who's joining us today. Lori, we know the Israeli elections were last week and you may still be recovering. So, so it's our turn. It's our turn today. Well, we just wanted to say thank you for joining us and for being part of this really important, wonderful conversation about your incredible book. I have to say, I read this book, ironically enough, on Tisha B'Av, which is sort of one of the most saddest days of the year on the Jewish calendar, but also the day in which you really write about in this book. The entire book sort of leads up to that moment in time, the destruction of the temple. And so it was not lost on me how significant it was that I was reading your book on that day. So I wondered if we could start maybe, as Nancy said, you ran across this sort of archaeological artifact, the gravestone of Claudia Astor, and it really inspired the story of Esther. I wondered if you would mind sharing sort of what struck you, why this is the direction that you sort of decided to go with in this book.
Right. Well, as we spoke about, the book was inspired by the discovery of a first century tombstone in southern Italy. And it was a major archaeological discovery because it was the first proof that Jews were brought from from Jerusalem to Rome as slaves. And we know now that Jews actually built the Colosseum, and the money to build the Colosseum and to rebuild Rome after the Great Fire in the first century was financed by the temple treasury. So the history of Jews and Jerusalem and Rome are very intertwined. And I just thought it was a fascinating discovery. And also the stone revealed a very unusual love story. And I was just captivated primarily by that. I didn't know much about ancient history. I love historical novels, like I know many of you. But for me, historical novels meant World War II, or maybe the Civil War, because I grew up in the South. But I didn't know very much about the first century. And as soon as I started learning more, I was really struck by how relevant our history is today. And you mentioned Tisha B'Av. That was a holiday, not a holiday, but it's a fast day. It's a day of Jewish history that didn't really speak to me. What does the Second Temple with animal sacrifice have to do with our lives? And even though I know that Jews for thousands of years have recited Psalm 137, if I forget thee, O Jerusalem, and we've thought about Jerusalem, and it's seared into the collective memory of the Jewish people, but it didn't really feel like it spoke to me. And as I started learning more and researching more for this story, I realized that there was a lot there. Rebel Daughter is based on the lives of real characters who lived, and we know about their lives, not only from the gravestone that was discovered, but by many of the other writings from that period, primarily the Jewish historian Josephus, who many of you may have heard about. And the combination of this incredible love story and a very unusual, incredible love story with this fascinating time period just drew me in.
Yeah, it's really incredible. I mean, historical fiction is one of those, I think it's one of those genres that's so incredibly important because it paints a picture that you can't get from a traditional sort of history book or archaeological site.
Exactly.
So it's really beautiful that you did that. I'm wondering, and I think everyone who's read it is wondering, what's the process that you went through to imagine the lives of these characters, and what inspired them? I mean, they all have such unique characteristics, and I think some of them are really representative of certain ideologies. I wonder if you could comment sort of on that process and how you kind of in your mind created this family and each of their unique characteristics.
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. And I think I was figuring it out as I went along. This was my first book. And that's probably one of the reasons, in addition to the obsessive research process that I went through, that it took me 10 years. First, I started with the research, the historical setting. I wanted to get it right. I felt an obligation not only to my real life characters who were real people, but also to my readers, because I know when I read a book, a historical novel, the first thing I want to know when I'm finished is how much of it is true. And it really bugs me when I find out that the author played, fast and loose with the facts. And I like to know what the real story was. So while there was much I had to imagine, whatever I could know, I wanted to know. What did the people eat? What did the daily life look like? What was the milieu like? And because I live in Israel, I'm now speaking to you I'm visiting friends near the Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee.
Raining. It's raining, right?
It was raining earlier. Now it's stopped. Because I'm here, I could actually go to the places where my characters lived, walk on the same stones. And I wanted to transport the reader back in time. So I had to get a lot of the details right. I wanted the reader to feel what it would be like to be, walking through the streets of Jerusalem, feeling the heat of the stones through their sandals, having your eyes burn from the smoke of the sacrifice, smelling the smells of the spices in the market. So I wanted to get all those details right, because you can't bluff it. Yeah, and this is, again, it's not like a World War II scene where we kind of just need a few details and we can imagine it. To imagine the first century, at least for me, even for me to imagine this story, I had to learn so much about what their life was like. And again, in Israel, you can go to many of the places. The stones where my characters 2,000 years ago walked are still here. I can see in Jerusalem the light, how it reflects off the stones, and what the city, what it looked like, at different times of the day. And I'm sure many of you have been to Jerusalem, and that emotional feeling you get when you stand in front of the Western Wall, the Kotel, even if you're not religious, that there's some kind of emotional magic that happens where you feel that gut punch, and I wanted the reader to have that emotional connection. There's a museum. Many of you may have been here and been to something called the Burnt House, which is actually an actual home of one of the priests of the temple. And it could have been the home where Esther, my character, grew up. And you walk into the Burnt House today and you see that the walls are still blackened with the ash and the soot from the fire of the year 70. And there's a skeleton on the ground, and you're standing literally a few feet away from this, of a young woman. And there's an iron spear in the corner of the room. And, I was just imagining a young woman, she's, huddled in her house, fearful, waiting for the Roman soldiers to burst through the door. And they do. And she tries to escape, and she doesn't make it in time. And, she falls on the stair as she's trying to run from the kitchen. And you see that. So it helped me imagine it. So I'd say the first part was trying to, recreate a historically accurate picture of what life was like and what it would have been like for my character. And then the second part was the more emotional side. And you said it before that, fiction can take you where history can't. You have an emotional connection. You're walking in the shoes of the character. And by the way, it's not only the author that has to imagine themselves into the characters, it's the readers too. And I think there's a leap of faith that authors have to make, that people are still the same. Even though our world is very different and we don't have, genocide or slavery, or we do have genocide, but we don't have it at the same level of degree. And we don't have the belief in magic or many of the other things that, characterize the first century. Yet people still want to live their lives in freedom and dignity. They're willing to fight for it. We see it in Ukraine. We see it all over the world. And they want to find love. So I think there's some universal truths, and that helped me imagine my character. Now, admittedly, I've never huddled in my house waiting for Roman soldiers to barge in, but I have sat in my shelter waiting for the next Iraqi Scud to fall. I have sat with my children. I know what that feeling of fear and powerlessness is like. I've sat in the waiting room, waiting for the surgeon to come out of the operating room. I know that feeling, and I tried to tap into feelings that are universal. My character's Esther, her struggle as a young woman to understand her place in the world. Who can't relate to that? So I'd say it was, the two-prong approach of the history, the external recreation of this world, and creating the interiority of the characters.
Right. And I think the other thing that you're saying that's really important is that, this event was 2,000 plus years ago, and it's actually one of the most kind of, I don't know what we want to call, like a crossroads event in Jewish history, right? Because the future of the Jewish world changed from that point on, in the way in which, the community moved to other locations, how rabbinic Judaism became the way in which now we really, as the Jewish community today, observe. So what you're doing is also making something so ancient, like you said, feel very, very relevant now.
Mhm.
And I want to ask you a question about that, because in the book, at the beginning of every chapter, you actually quote a source, whether it's like Torah-itic or Talmudic, or but it's from the sources of Jewish tradition. And I'm wondering why you did that, and sort of how you decided to do that, and what feedback maybe you've gotten since you decided to do that. I found it personally, as a reader, and someone who really believes, really finds a lot of meaning in historical text, the connection to the chapter itself was so brilliant and so spot on. But it also takes a certain amount of, I think, knowledge and understanding to make those connections. So I'm wondering about that process for you too, and why you decided to really look at those texts and bring it into the story.
So one of the processes that I went through in the research was just diving into the literature of the time period. And whether it was rabbinical discussions, or again, the historical writings from not only Josephus, but some of the Roman historians. And I just wanted to share those with the readers, because I found them so powerful. But it was a stylistic choice that doesn't work for all readers, because I think it does take some readers out of the story world. You're reading along, and then you get to a chapter break, and there's a different source. But I just wanted to share some of the beautiful writings and the literature of the time period. I think it shows what people of the time were reading and thinking about then.
Yeah, and it supports the story that you're telling also in a lot of ways, which was really appreciated. I'm wondering if we can move a little bit, and I want to ask you sort of about how this work, this book, this story that you wrote, is finding relevance today. I know, for example, the crowd that you maybe thought you wrote this book for is actually not the crowd that's reading it. So I wondered if you could tell everyone a little bit about how surprising that's been for you, the way in which sort of the Christian world is actually really attracted to this book. And then also, I think, the way in which you comment on the Jewish communal reaction to trauma is certainly from 70 a very different type of trauma than, let's say, the Shoah or the Holocaust of the 1940s. But I wonder, in your mind, if there's some parallels that you could speak about. So two kind of big questions there for you.
Okay, well, let me start with the audience. I wrote the book for the reader, a reader like me, mature Jewish readers. I was thinking of my book club and the kind of books that we love to get into, which are books that we learn a little bit from. We do a little time travel. There are a few meaty kind of philosophical issues for us to talk about. And that was the kind of book that I love to read. And that was the book that I love to write. But as a first-time author, when Random House was interested and they said they wanted to position the book for a wider audience, I wasn't really in a position to say, no, this is who you need to market it to. So they envisioned a different kind of audience, and I had to make a lot of edits, take out some of more of the Jewish, I'd say, hardcore content for, more about the different Jewish factions, and it was more violent, and it was a different book, and they wanted me to make changes, and so I did. And to my surprise, the audience has been different for two reasons. One is younger people are relating to the book. They relate to the coming of age story, and it's been distributed to a lot of schools. It won it was named a gold selection for the Junior Library Guild. So it's been distributed to hundreds of school libraries, which is very exciting, because I think the more people that can learn about Jewish history, the better. And I think there was I'd say from a publishing marketing perspective, Random House was looking to fill a need for Jewish historical fiction that wasn't about the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And then on the other surprising group that has connected to the book, and we talked about this earlier, and this totally floored me, was Christian audiences. Christians were, of course, Jews in this time period. And so this history is their history as well. The book won or was a finalist for the Christie, which is the highest award in the Christian Publishing Association. It's given by the Evangelical Christian Publishers Association. And they find this story something that they can relate to as well, which was extremely, extremely surprising to me. And when I tried to understand why, it's not exactly clear that, we see this history the same way. For many Christians, the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple is proof that Jesus's prophecies in the gospel came true. Of course, the gospel was written many years after the destruction, but nevertheless, they were the prophecy and they were written down. And I think to some Christians, this is proof that God has transferred his, his favor from the Jews to the Christians, or just kind of a validation of Jesus's prophecies. And also the early Christian authors believed that the destruction of the temple and Judaism was, I'd say, divine punishment for Jews maybe not accepting Jesus Christ. So there's a whole theory. But what was interesting to me was Josephus, who was, again, a Jewish historian. He is someone who's venerated by Christian audiences, and we only have his works because it was the church and the monks in these monasteries for hundreds of centuries who recopied them. Jews were not interested in what Josephus had to say, and the Jews of the time thought that Josephus was a traitor. He, again, was a priest who, just to remind some of you, he was a Jewish priest of the temple who became one of the leaders of the Jewish revolt against Rome. He was captured by the Romans, switched sides, became a Roman, actually advised the Roman general on the siege of Jerusalem, and went on to live in Rome after the destruction of Jerusalem as a Roman citizen in the emperor's old house with a very generous imperial pension. And he wrote the history of the Jewish war. And this is why we still have this history, because the church saved it. And again, there's a very interesting debate that is still ongoing today about whether Josephus was a traitor or was he a realist, because what he wrote about was not the version that the Christians are, I think, relating to today, but he has a different take on why it happened. But he was a proud Jew and never renounced his Judaism toward the end. And it was certainly braver to write this history when in a world where it would have been safer to say nothing at all than not to write it. So in a way, it was a defense of the Jewish people. So that's another side, a very interesting side answer. But I could go on and on talking about ancient history and Jewish Christian relationships, but it's fascinating. And one of the very, very interesting experiences for me has been speaking with church groups and hearing from people who said they maybe grew up in a home with not very many books. They would have just a Bible and the works of Josephus. And those were all the books they have. And it just shows the centrality of Josephus to the Christian tradition even today.
Yeah, it's really fascinating that particular group has been, I know you've been spending a lot of time speaking to Christian groups in particular. So it's really fascinating. And what about the second question about sort of how this is relevant for sort of those the Jewish trauma experience? Our history is full of it. And I'm wondering, how you thought about this book in terms of more modern history, and really like what we can learn about the Jewish response to trauma, maybe even in the face of the Holocaust. And as you noted, so many books are connected and related to the story of the Shoah, whether it's from the survivor perspective, from a righteous Gentile perspective. There's many different ways, and I guess I'm sort of appreciative of another story that talks about sort of Jewish trauma and a response to it, but it's also like, I'd love to hear from you why it's actually really relevant today. And even from the point of thinking about sort of the way in which, the Jewish community sort of integrated, whether forcefully or not, into the Roman world.
Mm-hmm. I think it's not only a story about trauma, even though, it certainly is. And in fact, many of the scenes of the book were so reminiscent of the Holocaust, the stories of the siege of Jerusalem, the starvation was so, I heard echoes in my mind of, ghetto stories that I had heard, and the march to Rome, and, is so reminiscent of the death marches from the camps. And so you can't help but make those comparisons. And even though it is a story of trauma, I think it's also a story of hope, because there's a lesson that what can be destroyed can be rebuilt, and what's lost can be found again. And we see that even 2,000 years later, we do have our state again. But there's a lesson in that it's so fast to tear down. And I think that's very relevant for us today, especially today, as we see the dangers of this fanaticism, and how civil discord can lead to civil war. What was very interesting for me in this story was that there were actually two wars going on in the first century. There was, again, the war with the Romans, but there was also a civil war. And many of the rabbis say that the reason that we lost, they call it sinat chidam, which is in Hebrew, and it means brotherly hatred, that it was the fratricide, and it was the Jewish infighting that led to our defeat. And in many ways, I think there's a lot of truth to that. And we see the power of rhetoric, which is very scary. We see it in modern day Israel, and what's happened in our political discourse today, and we see it obviously in the States, where the sides are very quick to demonize the other. And yet in the first century, the same thing was happening. There were the sons of light and the sons of darkness. For those of you who have seen the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Israel Museum, that motif is all the time. And what is a real Jew? And and again, they talk about that in modern day Israel. Who is entitled to live in this land, and what rights do they have? And it's the same debate that's going on. So I think there's a warning of this story for us that's very relevant, which is what happens when this aggressive nationalism and fanaticism goes unchecked, and the power of words, and what can happen when we go down that path. So there's a lesson there, and there's hope, like I said, because the hope to return to Jerusalem very much kept the Jewish people alive, and obviously because the Jews kept that hope alive. But the more we unpeel the layers of this story, the more we find these very chilling reminders of how little we've learned as a people.
Yeah, I was just thinking as you were speaking about even just the sibling relationship, how, they're very, in the story, they're very, very different in the way in which they think the Jewish community should react to the Romans, right? And that's just within one small family. It makes it really, really hard to make change and progress forward. But I also think that your message of hope and optimism is essential. So I appreciate that perspective, and I think all of us do at this time, for sure.
But the fanaticism, you alluded to it, but when you think about it, you had the Jews of the first century who were living in this small, remote province of the Roman Empire, on the eastern edge of the Roman Empire, with no army. And they declare war on the greatest empire the world has ever known, with hundreds of thousands of well-trained and fierce soldiers. And who are these people, and why would they do that? Why would farmers and peasants and craftsmen, go on this suicidal, march against Rome. And this fanaticism is something that I think we have to constantly, look to ourselves and, see where we're going with that.
Right.
And
try and talk across the aisle more, maybe, is what you're saying. Well, wondering if you could talk a little bit about yourself as a writer. This was your, sort of first debut novel, and it's also different than the career that you spent your career in. So I'm wondering, first of all, how that happened. I mean, what process you went through internally yourself. I know you said it took 10 years to write, so my guess is part of that was research, but maybe there was other pieces to that process. And would love to hear also, sort of as an Israeli writer who also happens to be Anglo, how that infused and influenced your decision to write, also because of where you're living, which is the place where it happened, as we say.
Right. So I've always wanted to write. And in fact, my husband and I, many, many years ago, when we were in grad school, wrote The Ice Cream Lover's Guide to Boston. And it was published. And we had a contract to write The Dessert Lover's Guide to New York. And then in one of those sliding door moments of life where you take a different turn, my husband got offered a job in Israel, and we moved to Israel. And then we ended up making Aliyah and building our lives here. And we both were very involved in the Israeli high-tech industry. I had gone to business school, so I became a strategy consultant, primarily for military companies who are trying to commercialize their technologies for the civilian market. And writing is something that I put on the side. Writing is like most creative passions. It's hard to carve out the time for it. It's not like even painting or gardening or baking where you have something to show for it. You could be writing for years and no one will read it. So you really have to have a lot of discipline and commitment and belief in yourself to take the time to write when there's always something. I'm sure, obviously, all you mothers out there know that you could always be doing another load of laundry or cleaning out the mold in the vegetable drawer. And there's always something that is going to need your attention more than spending the time writing, which it feels a little bit indulgent at times. And I wish that I had believed in that myself a little bit more as a writer. And because I've learned now that real writers don't find the time to write, they make the time. And you have to make it a priority, just like any other creative pursuit that's important to you and that you feel strongly about. I'd say had the luxury to do that when I retired. When I turned 50, I decided I'm going back to writing because, you don't have the pressure of putting food on the table or a lot of the family demands. And I'd say it was my retirement present to myself that I was going to give myself the time to do that. And I never expected to be a debut author, at my age. And I'm 63 now, so it's late to be getting into the writing game, but I love it. So I would say that I'm proof that it's never too late, but it's still better to start early, I think, if you have something that you're passionate about. But like many women, I had a very windy career path. I was also director of Sesame Street in Israel for a while. And I had a failed startup. I tried to invent a device to kill head lice with electro-optics based on one of the military companies, believe it or not, that I worked with, that had a technology to find defects in bullets. And I said, oh, well, maybe we could use that for something more useful, like finding lice in hair. And that's a whole nother story. But I've had a very windy career path. And I don't know if that's typical of being in Israel, where there's a lot of support, community support for children and good daycare, and it's affordable, and it's I had more chance in terms of being able to combine family life and work. But being in Israel is, especially in the years that we've been here, has been a fascinating time, because I'm sure many of you who have been here know how much Israel has changed from the 80s to now. It's really a different country because of the startup nation and the high tech industry, which again my husband and I both have been involved in. So
it sounds like you're crossing over many worlds, right? Like you have many, many worlds that you're a part of and have been a part of. I'll ask you one more question, but I just want to remind people that this is a good time. If they have their own questions that they'd like to ask, they can put them in the comment section, and I'm happy to share them with you. And we'd love to hear from those of you who are listening, and so that you can have your voice and add to the conversation. Please feel free. So I wonder also, I was thinking about the reaction that you said that, some of the Christian community had, and that this has been sort of a young adult crossover book, which was also interesting. I'm wondering if from the Jewish world, there has been anything surprising about the response, maybe from different segments of the community, whether maybe more on the Orthodox side, more liberal movements like the Reform and Conservative movement. Have you noticed a difference in response to this book at all? And then sort of additional question to that is this response in Israel different than the response in North America? I'm not sure if it's out in Hebrew. I guess that's one question. But maybe you can comment a little bit on that too.
Well, what's surprising is that I didn't get any blowback from different religious groups. And I was expecting it, because the book is basically a story about a Jewish woman who is captured and sold as a slave after the fall of the Second Temple, and freed by her Roman master, who falls in love with her. And the story of how a Jewish woman and a Roman found each other and fell in love is, a very unusual story. And I worried that it would be seen as, promoting some kind of assimilation or intermarriage. And I discussed this a lot with my historical consultant, who I worked with, Jonathan Price, who wrote historical appendix at the end of the book. And he is the chairman of the history department at Tel Aviv University and is Orthodox. And I said, I don't want to promote, intermarriage or how is this going to be seen? And he said, look, this is a real story. This is what happened. Not all of our history is, sanitized, politically correct. This was not the Jews' finest hour in many respects. This love story is just one of the many sides of Jewish history. But, it happened. We know it's a historically accurate story that these two people existed. And that's the story that I'm telling. My character does not denounce her Judaism. She does not become assimilated. She remains a proud Jew, to the very end. And that was important to me. So it's been very much accepted. Blue Greenberg, who's one of the premier, Jewish feminist Orthodox spokeswomen of today, wrote a blurb for the book and was very supportive of it. And I think people realize, they realize this is our history, and we're mature enough as a people to be able to say that, there's lots of different sides to our history. And the reality is that Jews over the centuries have had to become a part of different societies, and people have intermarried in, and that's something that works for many families, and it was a reality then, and it's a reality today. The other interesting side to this as an Israeli is the acceptance now of many of the myths that we grew up with that are considered myths. Like, people, again, who came to Israel many years ago, you might have been taken to Masada and shown that as a story of, courage, that they were willing to commit suicide rather than be taken as slaves. And that was the place that the inductees in the Israeli army were taken to be sworn in the early days of the state. And it was a place of pride. And you can see how that the Masada story, or the myth of Masada, would resonate with the early Israel, when Israel was, surrounded by these enemies. But now people look at that story and say, these were senseless fanatics. In addition to that, they were murderers. And if you look into the story of who were those people at Masada and what did they do and what was their legacy, it's not a positive legacy, and it's not a place where Israeli soldiers are taken anymore. But as a country, we're mature enough to say we don't need the myths. We're willing to look at our history honestly. And I think as a Jewish people, we're secure enough now to say, well, this was a time, the first century, where Jews were murdering each other. I mean, the story, as horrific as it is, and there were many incidences in the book of this Jewish factionalism, it was much worse in reality than what I wrote. The factions were kidnapping and torturing each other's families. And in addition to some of the instances that I wrote about in the book, where they were burning the food stores of different groups. And that was one of the reasons why Jews starved to death during the siege, because the Jews themselves destroyed the food. So, that's something else that as a people we're willing to say, okay, this happened, and what can we learn from it? It's not something that needs to be hidden or, spun in a positive light, but something that we can grapple with, the good and the bad.
The good and the bad. Well, I'm wondering, I think Esther, the heroine protagonist, I'm not sure. This is what I want to ask you. Mm-hmm. When you're talking about her, when you're thinking about the way in which you constructed her, she's highly problematic in a lot of regards, right? She is a female heroine and leader in the story. But I'm wondering, her own philosophies come into conflict throughout her experience in the story and in the book. And I'm really wondering, when one reads her story, do we see her as heroine, or do we see her as, majorly problematic? Or are we meant to see her as all of the above? Is she representative, perhaps, of all of the conflicting sort of feelings that perhaps people at the time were having? So I would love for you to just kind of dive into her for a second, a little bit deeper, and give us sort of a sense of why and how you constructed her ideologies, and they changed and they moved throughout the book.
That's a good question, because there's definitely a trope now, I would say, in literature, especially for books that are geared to a younger audience, of this feisty, gutsy young woman who is going to break all the gender norms. And that's, in right now. But that wasn't Esther. She very much stayed in her lane, in terms of staying Jewish, doing what her parents wanted her to do, marrying the person her parents had picked out for her. And it was important to me to make this character historically accurate. And I just don't think it would have been historically accurate to, sort of break out of all of the expectations of what a daughter and a wife and a mother would have been like in the first century. On the other hand, surely there were women who took leadership roles, and there were women who were literate. We know that women did read and write in the first century, not many. It was more of a class difference than a gender difference. The peasant women, or the women that had to work on the farms, wouldn't have had time to know how to read and write. But from the rabbinic literature, there were many discussions of learned women. Bruria, who was a wife of the disciple of one of the disciples of Rabbi Akiva, and there were archaeological discoveries of writings of women. There was Babitha of the desert. There were all these documents that she wrote. So we have proof of women's literacy. So whenever I knew there was a historical basis for something, I was willing to go with it. And her desire to learn, again, I think that is also historically accurate, and something that I wanted to have Esther be someone who was curious. And I think that there surely were women and girls then who wanted to learn and were curious about the world. Mm-hmm. So I didn't have a problem with the complexity. In fact, to me, that's what makes a character interesting.
That's right. The depth of her was very clear and very relevant to the story itself. As the content, as the moment changed, her thinking also needed to change, which was beautiful. Okay, so we do have a couple questions from people who are listening. The biggest one is they want to know what you're working on next. What's your next topic? Okay. What's your next story?
So, I probably shouldn't talk too much about it because at my pace, it could be another 10 years before it's out. But I'm working on a story set in the 1920s in Charleston, South Carolina, which is where I grew up, loosely based on the story of my grandmother and her sisters. And the 1920s, again, is a fascinating time when, cars were just beginning to be a mass-produced item, and radio, which has a lot of similarities with internet, and the consumer culture, and there's just and women's rights and women's roles and getting the vote and prohibition. So, I love to dive into rich historical periods. That's what I like. And then the Southern Jewish experience is one that I think hasn't really been fictionalized enough, and it's a rich history and one that I'm just having a lot of fun playing around in. So that's what I'm working on.
Wow, that sounds amazing. And it's at a time period right after a pandemic. So perhaps there's
yes, very much. Yes.
Wonderful. So I don't see any other again, just a reminder, if anyone wants to ask questions, they're more than welcome to put something in the chat, and I'm happy to share. I wonder maybe now if it would be possible for you to talk a little bit about, did you go to Rome, and did you actually have an experience in Rome where you saw this artifact, this gravestone, or did you come across the idea in another way? I guess I'm wondering, like you said, your experience with your next book is from probably where you came from. How did this Roman experience find its way to you?
Mm-hmm. So that's an interesting question. I heard about the gravestone and the discovery from Professor Price, who was working on a project with professors from all over the world. It was an international consortium of professors from Hebrew University and Oxford and Cambridge and Harvard, and they were trying to catalog inscriptions of the ancient world. And Professor Price's expertise was obviously inscriptions that were found in Israel, primarily those on bone boxes. Those were reflective of very unusual burial customs in the first century. And the Jews would not bury the people, but put them in bones for a year. I put them in bone boxes, limestone boxes, because they believed that when the Messiah came, that people would be resurrected and they would need their bones in order to live again. So he was cataloging these inscriptions, and he was telling me about them. And I said, well, tell me about something more interesting. He says, well, there was this gravestone and, this love story. And so that's how I found out about it. It was from a scholar who was working in the field.
So it wasn't a particular trip necessarily.
No, but then of course I did go to Rome and researched, and I love Italy, and there's any excuse I can find to go to Italy is wonderful.
It's a good one. Well, I'm just struck by, a lot of the sort of images in art and even in literature when we read about the expulsion from Jerusalem. We imagine, the art tells us or shows us sort of this horrible exodus of all of the amazing, beautiful artifacts of the temple on people's backs with, horses being taken to Rome. And you alluded to this earlier. You said that a lot of those spoils, let's call them that, were used then to sort of build beautiful spaces and beautiful things in Rome. And to the point where now there's even, I guess, certain members of certain parts of the community, maybe a little bit more religious, who are very careful about where they go in Rome. So I think it would be really interesting for people to hear a little bit about that. I don't think it's a story that we know. We have the image, but I think the image ends with leaving Jerusalem, and then we don't think about where all of those artifacts end up and what happened to them.
Mhm. Yeah, and if you've been to Rome and you've seen the Arch of Titus, which was erected to celebrate the victory over Judea and the Jewish defeat at the hands of the Romans, you see this very famous relief on the inside of the arch of this Roman soldiers carting away the table and the menorah of the temple. And there are Orthodox Jews who are very religious Jews who will not walk under the temple, under the Arch of Titus even today. And there's a stone that's recently been discovered in the Colosseum, which you can go if you've been there recently, that says that the Colosseum was built by Jews and financed by the treasury. So that's pretty much
a newer addition.
Yeah, that's pretty well known now, also in Rome and recognized. There were so many slaves taken to Rome that the price of the slaves dropped by a third. There were so many Jewish slaves, and what's interesting is that at the same time there were so many Jewish slaves in Rome, there was also a community of free Jews. Slavery was ubiquitous in the ancient world. People, it's not like our view of American slavery where it was based on race and you're a slave forever. People were moving in and out of slavery, and Jews owned slaves as well, which is something actually that my editor at Random House made me take out. But I wanted to keep it in because I had that my characters were slave owners before they became slaves themselves. I thought that was very poignant, but she thought that was too morally objectionable that people wouldn't identify with the character after knowing that they were slave owners. But there's much in the rabbinic literature about debt slaves, Jewish slaves that had to be freed after 7 years. And there were very specific rules about how you had to treat a Jewish slave and the conditions. But slavery, again, was ubiquitous. And there were many freed slaves in Rome that rose to positions of prominence. My male character, Tiberius, was himself a slave. He was captured in one of the early military conquests, which is how most slaves came to be slaves in Rome, which was they were captured in some war. And the people who survived were taken as slaves, and they became property immediately of the emperor. And so that's how Rome replenished its supply of slaves.
Yeah, that particular piece of the story was was really hard to read. I think the way in which you expressed it was beautifully written, but very, very difficult to read. Mm. I'm really sort of shocked by what your publisher requested to take that out, because we know it is part of our Jewish tradition. Which is why, as you said, we have, in fact, halachic rulings about how and when those slaves should find their freedom, and the structure of the week, and also meaning we have a Shabbat where even slaves are meant to rest. So it is part of us, kind of like warts and all. And it's very interesting that they ask you to take it out. So we have another question from the listener, the folks who are listening, wanting to know how you came up with the name, The Rebel Daughter, for the title.
Oh, that's a great question, because I actually did not come up with that name. My original name for the book was Daughter of Jerusalem, which is taken from Song of Songs. And the publisher, again, in one of their editorial decisions, said no one is going to buy a book with Jerusalem in its title. And again, going back to the rebel, trope that's so common today, and we always have to have a brave, rebel heroine. They push that, and I was actually very against it, because to me that had connotations of the Civil War, and I didn't necessarily think of Rebel Daughter as reflecting a book about the first century. But now that she chose it, so many readers told me that they agree with it, that they think she was a rebel. And it's led to a lot of very interesting discussions. But I think that there's a lot of, I'd say, marketing and commercial considerations that go behind many of the books that get published today and how they get positioned, that are not necessarily reflective of the author's dreams.
Yeah, it's really important that you're bringing this up as we're kind of doing this book fair experience over the course of a number of days, 10 days. I imagine that many authors have had similar experiences where you have an idea and then maybe your publisher has another idea, and it's that dissonance is hard, I can imagine.
But again, I'm glad that it didn't end up being a niche book just for people like me. I'm glad that other people can, see something that has value for them in this book, even though their backgrounds or their age or whatever is totally different. And even I've had that experience, and I'm sure you have too. You might have read a book in high school and, you read it a certain way, or you related to a certain character, and then you pick it up again decades later, and it doesn't even seem like it's the same book. I think Jewish readers see something different in the book than Christian readers, obviously. And young people maybe relate to the young woman and her struggle to find herself and to find first love. And, the mothers in the group, the parents, the older readers see different, nuances and more societal, considerations and themes. And so I think you bring as much to the book as the author does. And, I think Random House actually did me a favor by breaking through my mindset of who has to read this book and who this book is for, and imagining a wider audience. So, I'm appreciative of that.
Yeah, it became much more universal than maybe you thought, and less particularistic, which is really beautiful. Well, we only have a couple minutes left, and I want to ask you this very important question, which is, what are you reading right now? And what would you recommend? What's your recommendation to those listening of a book or something that we should be reading right now?
Well, I just finished, it's actually not a novel. It was a series of essays, Dara Horn's People Love Dead Jews. And I just found that, brilliant and fascinating. And, especially her essay. It's a series of essays, many about the Anne Frank house and the marketing of Anne Frank to the world, and also about families changing their names at Ellis Island and whether that really happened and why people are perpetuating those family myths. So I found that book fascinating. I also very much love Allegra Goodman's books. I don't know if many of you have read her. She wrote Catterskills Falls, The Family Markowitz. People call her the Jewish Jane Austen, and she has another book coming out very soon, a coming of age story, which I can't wait to read, called Sam. So you should all look out for that. And she's great. I love short stories as well. So I like the book. Cynthia Ozick is one of my favorite Jewish authors.
Yeah, she has a relatively new one that just came out. It's fascinating. Yeah. It's funny you mentioned Dara Horn because she was just in Detroit this last weekend. So I imagine a few people listening actually had the chance to hear her speak about that book. And I guess I will link it back to you and your work because, so the ancient Roman Jewish world is a long time ago, thousands of years ago. But in this book, you've managed to bring it to life, and you've really managed to give all of us sort of a solid, at least, understanding and, like you said, emotional response to what might have been. And I much prefer to sort of walk through life seeing the beauty and the wonder of history, even though it's sometimes challenging. And you've done a beautiful, beautiful job of that.
Thank
so
you.
I think your readers, I'm grateful, but your readers and everyone listening is grateful. So we need to end, but I will just let everyone know that the Stephen, who's helping us run the sort of in the background, is going to post a couple of links in the chat for you. If you've read the book and you'd like to give a review on either Goodreads or Amazon, the links will be there. And I know Lori would appreciate it. It's a great thing for us to do just as readers and supporters of her work. So I definitely would encourage everyone who's read the book and is ready to give it a review to do that. And then I just want to say thank you to you, Lori, for taking the time. I know it's later for you in Israel. We appreciate you taking a moment of your early evening out to spend some time with us. And thank you for giving us the gift of this book. It really was.
Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure. And Detroit is such an amazing community with so many voracious readers and book clubs. And I've done a few events by Zoom with Detroit readers, and they're always great discussions. So thank you for having me. It's a real honor.
It's our honor. Thank you. And be well, everyone. And don't forget to vote.
For sure. Bye.
Thank you, Lori and Rebecca, for being with us for such a wonderful discussion. And thank you to all of you at home for joining us. Our next event is today at 11:30 a.m. with a virtual program with Bonnie Garmis, speaking about her New York Times bestseller, Lessons in Chemistry. Remember to like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and visit our website, jccdet.org/bookfair for our full schedule and ways to get involved. See you next time.